Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening to celebrate the official launch of Pitchblende by Elise Marcella Godfrey. My name is Elsa Johnston, and I'm the interim director of the University of Regina Press. We'll start the event very shortly, but before we do, I would like to acknowledge the land we work on at the University of Regina Press and the importance of our treaty relationship to our existence here and mission as a press to be a voice for many peoples. University of Regina Press is located on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota nations, and the homeland of the Métis people. As with any event, there's always a bit of housekeeping to address. Please note that audience microphones will be turned off for the duration of the event. This event is live and is being simulcast to YouTube. So if you would prefer not to have your face in a public video, please refrain from turning on your camera during the event. And now tonight, I'm happy to welcome Warren Cariou as tonight's guest moderator, whose books, The Exalted Company of Roadside Martyrs and Lake of the Prairies, A Story of Belonging, have won and been nominated for numerous awards, including the Charles Taylor Prize for Literary Nonfiction and the Drainey Taylor Prize for Biography. He's also co-directed and co-produced 2 films about Indigenous people in Western Canada's oil sands region, Overburden and Land of Oil and Water. His films have screened at many national and international film festivals, including Hot Docs, Imagine Native, and San Francisco American Indian Film Festival. Warren will provide a short introduction to the book, which will be followed by a reading from Elise and then a Q&A session. Throughout the evening, we welcome you to participate in the discussion in the chat below. However, please be mindful that we strive to facilitate the safest possible space for our authors and guests. Please show kindness and respect to everyone in the audience. I don't think that's going to be a problem for this group tonight. Finally, there's just a quick reminder that you can purchase your copy of Pitchblende by visiting uofrpress.ca. A link to the book is also going to be provided in the chat. And now, without further ado, I'm very pleased to turn the floor over to Warren Cariou.
Thanks very much, Elsa. It's an honor to be a part of the celebration of this remarkable book. And it's a real pleasure for me to have a chance to speak with Elise Godfrey for the first time. Read the manuscript and been very impressed by it. So this is a wonderful opportunity for me personally, and I'm hoping that everyone will enjoy this conversation as much as I'm looking forward to it as well. And for audience members, thank you so much for being here, and I'm looking forward to your questions as well. I'm hoping that we can field a number of questions that Elise will be able to address. So I just want to begin with a brief introduction of Elise. And as I mentioned, I don't know her well yet, but we have just met. But Elise Marcella Godfrey has published in literary journals such as Subterrane, Room, Prism, and Grain. And her relationship with uranium began with a piece of pitchblende that she acquired in Nelson, BC in 2008. And this in a way is, I guess, the beginning of this book. That piece of pitchblende, which was originally from Great Bear Lake, was identified and surrendered to a secure site at the University of Saskatchewan while she was writing the poems in this book. Elise now lives with her family on the traditional territory of the Kaikai Nation in British Columbia. And I've been thinking a lot about this book since the first time I read it in typescript form. And my own interests are in Indigenous perspectives on energy and Indigenous communities and their experiences with modern forms of energy, usually in relation to extractive politics, but also Indigenous practices of energy and the philosophies of energy that are there in Indigenous cultures themselves. And so I was really struck by the story of how these poems came to be, as well as the richness and the evocation that she brings to these these narratives of Pitchblende. This book is really about human connectedness to stone, and to a particular stone that has a powerful role in world history and in the history of settler colonialism on Turtle Island. By focusing on the materiality and, in a sense, maybe the spirituality even of this stone called Pitchblende, Elise Godfrey uncovers nearly forgotten legacies of the nuclear age, revealing the ways in which colonial power is implicated in the poisoning and the violence unleashed in the name of energy. These poems also bring our attention to largely unknown series of testimonies by Indigenous elders and land-based people who were interviewed as part of the hearings before the construction of the Rabbit Lake uranium mine in Saskatchewan. Hearing these community members' voices shared through the medium of poetry is a very moving experience. We hear the wisdom, the emotion, and the critical intelligence of these Indigenous people, most of them Dene people, who express their concerns about the uranium mine, concerns that still resonate for us today. It is a book of powerful lyricism, as well as rich storytelling, and at times biting irony. It makes us think differently about our relationship to stone and our connections to that material which has been extracted and refined to fuel the dreams and the nightmares that we associate with modernity. So with that brief introduction to the book, I would like to turn the floor over to Elise, who can give us the poems themselves. So thanks, Elise, and congratulations on this amazing, amazing book.
Thank you very much, Warren. Thank you for such an excellent introduction. I'm going to read a selection of poems that span the entire book. I'm not going to read any of the testimonies themselves for a variety of reasons. Some of them I find very hard to read. I get choked up partway through them, and I don't really want that to happen tonight. And I also have concerns still about sort of just, the voices themselves and the way that I've used them, but we won't get into that right now. So I'm focusing mainly on poems that were, written off of the transcripts in a sense. I was writing while reading and going back and forth. So I'll begin with the first poem in the book, Follow the Water. Follow the water, Delaney, Northwest Territories. From the mouth of the widest river, along the shield's edge, from the Great Lakes Northwest, past Hudson Bay to the Beaufort Sea, Winnipeg, Reindeer, Athabasca, Great Slave, Great Bear. Fresh water runs on an angle, cuts across the continent. Port Radium, Northwest, Port Hope, Southeast, mine and refinery. Between Snake Rivers, rail line ladders, track the pageant from glacial retreat to the hammered roots of trade. And next I will read Labine. He was the man who first discovered pitchblende, or identified it as being pitchblende in the Great Bear Lake area. Labine, Echo Bay, Great Bear Lake. St. Paul snowblind, no charcoal on his cheeks. A poultice of tea leaves over his eyes. Labine left him in the dark shack, went to stake the claim. A great wall seamed with silver, cobalt bloom, copper green. Marigold oxide on the black rock, like powdered sunshine lichen. A piece of ore the size of a plum. He knew it by its specific gravity, solid pitchblende, straining to hold more energy than it could contain, throwing off gamma rays, errant vibrations that penetrate in waves. And on page 12, I know some people like to follow along, so I'll say the page numbers going forward. The North is not a barren land. Some see this province as straight lines, landlocked lakes of flax, highways running past steamrolled horizon, grid road, rail track. But just as the echoes of the Cypress Hills near Swift Current spool off the tongue of a billion-year-old vibration, the northern landscape troubles this mirage, undulates, not a heat wave, a watermark, rippling surface. Intricacy of river work, latticed waterways, a system of lakes unlocked, knotted here and there, pulse suppressed, energy tapped for cash, light, switches, ignitions. What comes from where? So fixed on the dirtiest pits, we speak little about real needs, what we take without asking. Assumptions we make about survival, sustenance, nourishment, luxury. Food grows in the boreal forest, woodland caribou, moose, spruce grouse, trout, blueberry, cloudberry, bearberry, mossberry, juniper, currant, indigo milk caps, morels, chanterelles, wild rice, lichens. People have fed and healed here for thousands of years. Real needs are perceived by the heart and gut, edible berry, potable water, returning herd or spawning run, body's response to the rhythms around us, not the mind's design, not the thought that nags how much, enough. And on page 14, I will read When Women Speak, Hidden Bay. They speak into a void, a pit, its sides not precipitous but ridged, a corkscrewed point of entry, a spiraling tunnel through the lithosphere. Look into it, milky green water, as if golden moonglow lichen crushed and glittered into it. Their voices fragment, merge, split again, reconfigure like beads of mercury in the bottom of a tailings pond. And on the following page, 15, I will read Ore Body. We began to dig ourselves deeper than we dreamed when we began to see metal as other than medicine, our bodies more than mineral. Copper traces our skin, iron our blood, alkaline earth our bones, teeth, heartbeat, potassium, sodium our pulse, sulfur, selenium, zinc. And skipping ahead a number of pages to page 22, I will read Parse the Numbers. A language of weight, tons of ore, tens of thousands, wealth's overburden, its wages, how to satisfy a world that wants to sleep with lights on, heat high. In the city, glass towers glow from within all night, whole schools of light, fluorescent, incandescent, halogen, ultraviolet, black, cathode blue, limitless expansion. Isn't this the myth we still whisper in our sleep? We made light from stone, but only after we made it explode. And on page 32, I will read Cosmochemistry Part 1. I will read Part 2 as well. Before language, our galaxy opened, a black hole at its core. Born in sudden light, the sound of our eruption dampened by expansion. We began in an explosion, born by death, empty space scintillating. We began in clouds of dust and gas. And on page 34, I will read Water. What sets our planet apart, allows our survival, where our story begins and ends. Creation myths, floods, yet the world will end in fire, fire that finds its way into water, fire that takes water's form and spreads beneath the earth's surface, subterranean, unseen, invisible fire that cannot be smothered or doused, Those it singes don't know they've swallowed the sun until mouths fill with cinders, marrow turns to ash. Not only the taps near the fracking fields leaking flammable gas, but the northern waters, those in which fish still spawn, those we spin into gold, damned. Waters we consume at a rate the rest of the world can hardly imagine. Waters we contaminate, break. And on page 50, jumping ahead through testimony, how to sift the many metals. Lead in the lake bed's silt sinks so swiftly. No sieve made for this, except a fish's liver or its mouth full of mud. A skiff skims the surface in slow circles, mirrors the microscope's myopic lens. What won't the single sample show? The many pathways radium takes as it decays. Always there is more, unseen, traveling below at the pace of stone. Changes accumulate, accrue in increments, inching outward into the unknown. And on the following page 51, our anger is radiant. Not just the finish on our skin beneath this fluorescent ceiling or the luminous glass of our eyes as our throats constrict while we speak. No, it is a heavy tone materializing in the air between us. It is filling the room. Soon the room will be trembling with it. It will tighten us all until we become fixed where we stand, sit. Our anger is elemental. It is coming through us from beneath our feet. We cannot contain it. We do not control it. It will spread. A kind of liquid fire, something between gasoline and flame. See it glow and wait for it to explode. And on page 56, collapse. Occurs close to the earth from cracks in its foundation. Lowest orders fall first. Roots die at their deepest, oldest, and earliest, invertebrates, smallest and softest, some barely visible, shells coiled in codes, exoskeletons exposed. On page 60, Anthropocene. We can't just consume, we need to conserve. Heat, seeds, generate more of our own light, burn beeswax, breathe fireweed, forage, ferment. Remember, darkness teaches us to listen, sleep less in summer, more in winter. This is our future. Night accelerates and the outer limits of the cosmos drift farther from shore, a lengthening exhale. We are consumptive, blood in our lungs, tar, radiotoxic dust, coal, shale, oil, ore. We crack the ancient world's ribs for our one last gasp. And on the following page, 61, Cosmochemistry, Part 2. What lies beyond the earth and sky? Realms from which this radiant rock arrived, pillars of dust, distant light, innumerable nebulae. How long will we live? The rock will remain. How long have we lived? In the story of life on earth, an instant. What came before? Multitudes, long reels of annelids, the ammonite and coelacanth. What will outlive us? Some of the above, none of the above. Eventually all will return to dust. Our sun is set to swallow us. And on the following page, 62, Pyrocene. Our own star was never enough for us. We were envious of the sky's thin white fire, flint's fricative shift, the sound of it catching, spirant, sudden rush of breath. First we burned wood, then whole forests that died before we took form, coal-fired, carboniferous, ancient heat beneath our feet. And just two more. On page 66, I will read Fallout. Smoke from northern fires drifts south. Winds, indiscriminate, prevail. Fallout from Chernobyl, fallout from Soviet tests. Boreal forest a shroud around the shoulders of the world. A lamp left burning. Sand from southern fires drifts north. Fallout from Nevada's test site once dusted Saskatchewan's south. Nearly 1,000 explosions over 40 years. Grain in wind shimmered an electric desert sheen. You couldn't see it or smell it, but the radon hung in your lungs like mist in a coulee, waiting to precipitate like salt in an alkaline slough. Every tilled tract of land, how soil breathes, gases that catch and release. And finally, on page 75, I will read the last poem in the book. Our fatigue is the future. A weighted quilt stuffed with a radiated goose down. We are sleeping under it, dreaming of water. The glitter of it early in the morning or late in the day. They thought the sun was rising on a new era, visions of this liquid white heat churning like the underside of a steamship. This would be better than any railroad ever was, better than any wind farm or solar field. Their future was something they imagined illustrated in a magazine glorifying the Anthropocene, an article never to be written because we know now what we knew then. Nothing has changed. It has only grown heavier and harder. Harder to look away and pretend we hadn't seen it coming clear as the sunrise. It's setting now, the sun upon the story, a layer of something neatly woven, thin strips of bark from larch and aspen. Our fatigue is the way fingers feel, rubbing the thinness from what's left of a day. We say we are tired, and what we mean is there is very little light left for us to make here. You'll need to find your own flint from here on in. Thank you.
Thank you for those amazing poems, Elise. That's wonderful to hear them.
You're welcome. Thank you for listening.
Just gonna leave a moment for people's responses here, reactions.
Okay.
To me, the poems, they are voice poems in a way. And so it was really great to hear them read. And I've got a lot of things I'd love to talk about. We've only got a short time, but I do want to talk about voice at some point soon here. Just seeing more responses coming in. So hold off for a second just so you can see those, which is great.
Sure. I have to say too that some of the people commenting are former workshop mates from my first ever poetry workshop with Lorna Crozier, which was 2005, 2006. And some of us are still in touch.
Wow, that's wonderful. Those friendships made in creative writing workshops last for a long, long time.
Yeah, they do.
That's great.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll invite our audience to continue making comments, and if you post questions in the chat, we'll have a chance to address some of those toward the end of our discussion as well.
All right.
But yeah, I've got a few things I'd love to talk about,
Sure.
and we'll see where the discussion goes. But I guess I wanted to start with what in my imagination anyway was the beginning point for this book, which is the stone itself, that piece of pitchblende.
Yes.
And I love how you talk about in the book about how the stone reveals itself. Was that part of the process for you? I mean, was it this relationship that you had with this stone, which you didn't really fully understand at first?
Yes.
Became part of it?
It was a very strange thing that happened as part of this whole process of writing this book. I did not know, well, I knew that I had pitchblende in my possession, but strangely enough, I didn't know what pitchblende was. I had tried Googling it, but at the time that I found this thing, I don't know, the internet was a smaller place then than it is now. And surprisingly enough, I couldn't really get any clear answers about what it was. So the rock itself was about this big, and it was black and very heavy. And it was in a little paper box that had like marbled painting on it. It was this very mysterious little object. It had a little piece of paper inside it that said, Pitchblende, Great Bear Lake. And I was like, this is cool. And I collect rocks. I have all kinds of minerals. So yeah, I had this thing for a number of years, at least 4 years before I started this project. And yeah, over the course of, and this project started in a very strange way. I had a whole bunch of different ideas that were sort of all loosely connected, and I wasn't really sure where I was going. And then at some point I sort of decided to do more research into uranium mining in Saskatchewan. I was just kind of curious about it. Wound up finding the transcripts at the university through that process. And as the research went on, and I was reading quite widely, quite a bit of nonfiction while also reading the transcripts and writing these poems. So at some point it became clear to me that this rock I had in my possession was probably not a safe thing to have. And my husband actually borrowed a Geiger counter from someone at the university. He works in medicine, so he was able to access this somehow and brought it home. And yes, we were horrified to discover that it was highly radioactive, this rock. And luckily, you know, I kept it more than a meter away from my person at most times. So yeah, and I had the option, I could have kept it, but I would have had to have acquired a lead box to keep it safely in. And I really had to ask myself if I wanted to acquire a lead box so that I could carry this heavy rock around for the rest of my life. And I decided I did not want to do that. And the university had a secure site. The scientists there were very happy to receive it. They were quite excited about this. They thought it was quite interesting. So it's safe. They have lead boxes there to keep such things in. So, and I did hesitate to turn it in. I had grown fairly attached to this rock. So it was a bit of a process handing it over, but I think it was the right thing to do.
Wow. Well, yeah, it's an amazing story. And it seems that in the relationship with that rock, I guess, in a way, it continued through the writing.
Yes. Yeah. And it was a relief to be free of it, to know that this dangerous thing that I had been carrying around for some years, yeah, I was freed of its influence. So.
Well, that's extraordinary. And I think that, yeah, just the way the poems are about bodies, right? There's so much about the way in which bodies are influenced by radiation, but by other kinds of contamination, other kinds of physical, sometimes visible and invisible influences.
Yeah.
I don't know if you want to talk about that, or just, you know, I'm thinking about as you were reading the poem Ore Bodies, and it just it sounds, when you say ore bodies, it also sounds like our bodies, and it just how stone and body are so interconnected in the book. It's just so rich to me.
Yeah, well, the fact is our bodies really wouldn't function at all without minerals. I mean, we really can't get through a day without sodium and potassium, at least. You know, all our neurochemistry, as far as I understand it, or, you know, our sort of, you know, processes of neurotransmission and various other not only neurochemical processes, but just, you know, our heart rate, all these, you know, the electrical systems in our body are regulated through largely through minerals. And we really couldn't survive without them. We've evolved. And in that sense, you know, this idea that, you know, we come from the earth, or we are part of the land, we are the land, you know, as human beings. And I know, you know, a number of different Indigenous cultures talk about that, you know, being, you know, belonging to the land rather than the land belonging to people. And it makes a lot of sense to me in a, you know, sort of philosophically, as well as, you know, in a very literal sense. We have evolved out of this place, this earth, and everything that is, you know, everything that is part of it. So, you know, the space we find ourselves in now, where I think so many people don't feel that viscerally, you know, on a daily basis. I don't know how, maybe, I'm sure some people do have this awareness, but I get the impression that others don't really think about it that much. And it's something that I do think about a lot.
Yeah, in that poem, Our Bodies, I was really struck by the lines, metal as other than medicine, our bodies more than mineral. And that also it reminds me of the medical uses of radium and of nuclear medicine in general. And so, yeah, your thoughts on that in relation to the damaging side of
well, it's a tricky thing because it does these medical isotopes are necessary for not only diagnostic purposes but also treatments. I mean, ironically enough, cancer treatments involve radiation and to great effect. So there are I think potentially ethical applications for radioactive materials. It seems, however, unfortunately, the way that the industry, extractive industries operate, it's such a tricky thing. I wish that we had like one dedicated mine in a agreed upon place, and it was the source of all our medical isotopes and all the radiation we needed for treatment, and we could just leave all the other possible applications aside. But unfortunately, the human mind and human society does not seem to work that way. So the other applications, nuclear energy, the sad history of it is that from what I can see, I don't know. I hesitate to make some sort of conclusive statement about whether it's done more harm than good, because, as I say that, I think about how many people do I know who've, successfully received radiation treatment, several. So, I do think it has its applications. And I think if there were to be any sort of ethical use for radioactive materials, it would be in medicine. I'm not convinced that it's worth it for electricity. And I certainly think it's regrettable, to say the least, that we created so many weapons with it.
Yeah, the connection between the weapons industry and the power industry in the history of uranium usage are really powerful. Absolutely.
Yeah. It comes up in some of the poems, and I did quite a bit of reading around that, and this was something that came up a lot in the transcripts that I read, which were it was about 2,000 pages of transcripts. So there were all kinds of people who took the time to speak. And it was one thing that some people brought up in Saskatoon at the time that this was happening. There were a number of people, some of them affiliated with the university, other people who were just really concerned about where it was going and saying, like, we're selling it to countries that haven't signed the non-proliferation treaty, and the one example that really struck me that is used in I included in one of the poems was, the case of, the United States promised not to use any of the uranium sold to them by Canada in weapons, but once they've used, I think it's usually plutonium that's left over from electrical purposes, they repurpose it. And in fact, it's been used in munitions and has, scattered throughout other parts of the world now as a result. So, there are all these sort of things get repurposed and reused. A lot of these materials are still highly radioactive after they've been used for their initial purpose. They remain radioactive for some time. And it's disturbing to think that, radioactive materials would be intentionally repurposed in bullet casings, but that was some of the reading that I did, So yeah, it's hard to keep track of it. I think countries like Canada and also Australia and other countries that produce large quantities of it, I think, like to pretend that they're very careful about who they sell it to and how it's used, but it's not really that simple.
Yeah, and I think the poems also really touch on, I guess, the afterlives of the material, right? Or the extraordinary timelines that we're thinking about. And as you say, the rock will remain.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any other reflections on that? I guess on the enormous timelines that you're writing about here, and how the stone is sort of resonating with that.
I'm quite fascinated by time in general and its passage and how we try to record it, and sort of ideas about time. Is it linear? Is it nonlinear? And I think it's very hard for the human mind in the same way, people talk about how hard it is for humans to sort of conceive what a billion even is, like how big is a billion? It's our little brains sort of, or at least my little brain sort of short circuits somewhere after a million. I think it's hard to kind of visualize and conceptualize such large numbers. So yeah, I think a lot about sort of the passage of time and the evolution of our planet and life on our planet. And and it's dizzying thinking about how long some of these materials will remain radioactive, and the issue of storage and nuclear waste storage and disposal, as if there's such as if there's a way to do such a thing safely. There is no disposing of this, really. That's the thing. It's like you have to bury it, and you have to bury it really securely. And even then, it's like, okay. Yeah, no, it's some of these materials, they take so long to break down. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but they sort of, the half-lives are very long. So, yeah, these are not materials that are easy to dispose of safely.
Yeah, I think, for me, one of the really fascinating things about this is that you're approaching these topics through poetry. I guess, we think about poetry in certain ways in relation to being addressed to the future as well, or sort of having a life beyond the initial writing of it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on on the choice of poetry to address these issues, or just, was poetry just your métier from the beginning, or?
Yeah, it's just sort of how my brain works. It seems to be where I gravitate. I think part of it for me is that, when I do a lot of research, I read a lot of nonfiction, actually, and I read a lot of nonfiction, as I said, while I was working on this, but I get very bogged down in details sometimes. And then, the process sort of, can get a bit stuck or slow for me when I get too bogged down. And so poetry for me is often a way of kind of, I think, using the parts of my mind that work best. I'm very oriented visually and also, sort of musically. So for me, using language to write poetry, it just feels very natural. And it's a way of communicating that I think sometimes allows me to move more quickly or loosely between topics and make these kinds of associations between things that might take a lot longer or be harder to articulate using a different kind of language.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to remind our audience members, there's still time to add questions. If you would like to have a question addressed by Elise. We've still got a little bit of time, but I would like to ask a couple more questions if possible, if there's time. One, I would like to really just talk a little more about the archive and how the archive and your reading of it and your sort of, I guess, thinking back to that time. I think it was 1993 when the hearings were being taken. Going back to that time and creating poetry now, how was that process for you? And what was, I guess I find it fascinating that you're taking an archival source and turning it into poetry as well.
Yeah, I think I found it, I don't know, I got very excited when I found the transcripts because I felt like I had found something. It was unexpected. I didn't go looking for transcripts. I was just researching uranium mining in the province, and I was interested in using sort of unusual materials to do this. So I looked at a number of, I did some experiments actually too with geological articles and things like that, academic papers about the mine specifically, in the language in those. Some of it was so rich, some of the geological terminology. I did some collages and mashups with those, but they didn't end up in the book. I think they were just too weird. I think I dropped them at some point. They were hard to read too. But the transcripts were really it was exciting finding them because there were just so many different voices. Again, it was about 2,000 pages total. And they were, some volumes were quite slim. They're in the University of Saskatchewan library, or at least they were about 10 years ago. And I believe they're also housed in the archives in Regina. And they had this red plastic spiral binding, and each volume was dedicated. They were organized by place. So, there would be like a fairly slim volume for a smaller community like Black Lake, Northern Saskatchewan. And then, when the hearings were in Saskatoon rather, there were thicker volumes, and sometimes 3 or 4 volumes over the course of several days. So they tended to spend more time in sort of larger areas where more people were, likely to come out. But it was such an interesting sort of way of kind of almost mapping the province in a sense, or going on this little sort of trip or tour around the province. And back in time too, I was 6 years old in 1993. So it was kind of funny for me too, reading them when I was reading them, to, sort of imagine where I was and that this was going on. And I can't imagine that very many people in other parts of Canada were sort of tuned into this at the time in the same way that maybe more people would be now, just different communication platforms now. And this was sort of, I don't know, maybe some people were like emailing then, but the internet wasn't really commonly used. Yeah, and it was at a time too, where there'd already been, at least a couple decades of sort of growing environmental awareness, talk about pollution and, the nuclear industry and climate change. And this was one of the things that was sort of most interesting too, is the people who were, concerned about climate change in the early 90s and had been throughout the 80s, because the science was already emerging at that point in time, or had been emerging for some time even. And people talking about wind and solar and alternatives. And it's like, reading the stuff decades later, it was like nobody's been listening ever. Like, why are we still discussing these things? How it takes generations, I think, to really kind of shift people's thinking and perspectives and make change. So yeah, it was a bit strange to have that sort of generational gap in the timeline, and to be reviewing people's concerns from decades earlier, and to see that these concerns had really still not been meaningfully addressed by industry or government. And it goes on. That's
really I guess disheartening in a way, but it resonates for me, this idea that it wasn't that people back then didn't know, right? Yeah. There were people who were very aware and just were ignored.
Yeah, absolutely. It was, an unpopular opinion, and it was, I think, easier to sort of push it aside then than it is now. But yet, we still see it's fairly easy to push it aside now. Still, people.
Yeah.
So the transcripts were just really fascinating documents to me. It was just, there were some real characters who showed up sort of out of nowhere. And then there were kind of like core groups of people, like the chorus of women was derived from this group of women who were, they were settlers, and they would travel around. They would follow so there was like the panel of federal appointees who were kind of overseeing the process. And so you got to know those names because they were everywhere. They were in every transcript. And then there was the corporate proponents panel. And again, like I can still remember one of the guys' names. And some of the there are a few lines that are pulled directly from the transcripts, like, their response to one elder's concern about cancer rates. They, launching into this explanation about, we don't have any statistics for Northern Saskatchewan, and the phrase insults on the body, an accumulation of insults on the body, that was verbatim out of one of the corporate proponents' mouths. And I was like, okay, still remember that guy's name. Anyway, it was pretty interesting in that way, reading to the back and forth. And, I included it in the book too. In L'Orange, there was quite a back and forth between the biologist who was on one of the federal appointees, who was kind of part of the group that was kind of trying to oversee this. And he really went back and forth for a while with one of the corporate proponents, trying to sort of, advocate on behalf of some of the other community members, and in this case, Indigenous community members who had spoken up and were trying to, were expressing concerns that the corporate proponents in many cases were sort of deliberately oversimplifying or diminishing. And then, the biologist would speak up and be like, well, I don't think that's what they're concerned about. It was interesting to see that whole process unfold.
I really like how that's reflected in the book, where we have these pieces that are from the perspective of the company. Yeah. And so that you've made poetry out of corporate doublespeak, because that's a huge accomplishment.
It was surprisingly easy and entertaining to do in some ways too. You know, like they would just start listing off their numbers, like the amount of money that would come in, or, you know, then there was one point at which they were trying to convince people that they had studied the site. And so they started talking about the beaver and muskrat survey from 1976. And I'm pretty sure I started laughing out loud. I'm like, sure, yeah. The beaver and muskrat survey from 1976. That's really helpful. Like, what? Yeah,
Yes.
I have a dark sense of humor, I guess. So I in some ways enjoyed reading the transcripts, but it was also very saddening and infuriating in many ways too.
Yeah, that really comes through. But I think that, yeah, the satire is an important part of the story as well that you're telling here.
Yeah, it's like,
So,
do they hear themselves? I don't know.
Yeah, so I see we've got some really good questions coming in here now. So I want to see, we've got about 10 minutes left here. So one from, let's see here, they're all coming up at the same time here now. So, okay. So Claire is asking, how did you know that, when you had the Pitchblende, how did you know that that's what it was? And what is it like? She's asking, what is it like, that Pitchblende?
Well, I knew it was Pitchblende because it had a note in the box when I got the box, and very foolishly at the time I was like, oh cool, and added it to the collection. And I did do, like I said, I did do some Googling, but it didn't really click or come together for me for some time. It was a very strange rock. I mean, it sort of looked like, it was a very dense, very hard rock with kind of almost jagged edges. It looked like something that, I don't know, one might feel inclined to make a weapon out of or something. It was hard and heavy and sharp at the edges. And it had sort of these almost strange little bubbles on it. Like it almost looked like it had like tar that had like bubbled up out of it and then hardened again. It was a kind of an intense looking rock. And it was a good size too. Like it was, you know, it could easily fill my whole hand. And it was very satisfying to hold. I hesitate to admit this, but it was very calming. I didn't hold it often, thank goodness. And I'm glad I didn't ever like put it under my pillow or something ridiculous. But yeah, I have pictures of it somewhere, long lost.
Yeah, the sensory aspects of it. I think that's so interesting.
Yes.
Okay, lots more questions here. So Ruth is asking, and this is again related to this, but how has your relationship to the material changed over the course of the writing of the book? And this relationship between lyric and dramatic, did these weaving of the voices of the transcripts change the way you used or wanted to use your own I?
Yeah, I think it did. I had to, at a certain point, especially through the editing process, I had to become very mindful of who was speaking in each poem, because yeah, I wanted the form of the transcripts to remain so that you could hear different voices and see the exchange between different sort of characters, so to speak. And it was tricky too, because I did have my own poems that I was writing sort of alongside the process. So what it looked like when I was reading the transcripts is I sometimes would get really excited or interested by something that someone would say, and it would spark an idea, and I'd start, you know, on a adjacent page scribbling my poem. And then there were also passages coming directly out of the transcripts where I wanted to use, you know, I was sort of taking too much from the transcripts and had to kind of keep those. It's like, I can't just, you know, reiterate someone else's testimony and call it my poem. So there were instances where there were sections of testimony that I wanted to use, and I had to find a way to kind of craft those so that they could stand on their own and still represent, you know, what had been said or what was spoken, and then also find ways to kind of include my own work and my own responses to these pieces. So yeah, so it's sort of a blend of, you know, my own writing and then what I have done with the testimonies, which, you know, I've done different things with the testimonies in different places. There are the erasures, and then there are passages that read as, you know, verbal exchanges between different people. So it was a tricky thing to navigate, and it was easy to get a bit turned around sometimes and start, you know, speaking as myself, and then realizing that I, you know, didn't want to be putting words in other people's mouths necessarily, and or taking words out of other people's mouths. So there was a lot of, there was a lot of finessing around that. And sort of, I hope that we managed to get to a place where it does read fairly clearly in terms of who is speaking. And yes, the assumption, that anything that's not attributed to a speaker in the testimony is the poet speaking, me. Yeah.
Yeah, and I thought you did a really good job of, of just being sensitive to the positionality of the people speaking. So we have these, parts that are from the testimony of the Indigenous community members, of the women, and then of the corporation. And I think you've been really sensitive to all of those, and so I think that's a real strength of this collection.
Thank you. It was a major concern of mine and others, and something that, it's possibly one of those things where, it's hard to get it sort of perfect. There may be, I won't go too much into that, but it was tricky to navigate, the different voices and my own voice, and making sure that, attributions were relatively clear without getting sort of completely, it's not a nonfiction project. And I mean, the testimonies are out there if anybody wants to go, read them directly, and they are interesting, in my opinion, worth reading. But
yeah. Well, I think what is so important in that kind of work, from my opinion, is that you're going to it with a good open heart to be honest to those stories. And that's my sense of how those turned out, really, is that was the case. I haven't read the testimonies themselves, but it really comes through in the way you've rendered it. So
that was my intention. I wrestled with it, and part of me felt like, okay, well, I don't want to just sort of steal these voices and their testimonies and use them for my own purposes, but it also didn't feel right to exclude them either, and to sort of further marginalize them and say, well, I don't feel qualified or entitled to speak on these people's behalf. But the thing is that I'm not really speaking on their behalf, because they already spoke for themselves. So I've gone back and forth and in many, many circles around this exact topic. And I have had to come to rest on the fact that I know what my intentions were and are, and it's a sensitive issue for sure, helping yourself to testimonies, but I did try to do it with an ethical sensibility and some sensitivity.
Yeah, and to me, what you're doing is amplifying these voices, and these people spoke eloquently at the time, and you're just making those available in another generation and in a different form. And I think that's a really important thing to do. That
was the intention. So I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah. So I guess we've got time for maybe one more. I think you addressed Danielle's second question. So Chelsea is asking, have you noticed any physiological or energetic changes in yourself from the time you spent with that Pitchblende?
Yes, Chelsea, I will never be the same. I don't know. I really don't know. I mean, it's a good question. I would have to spend some time thinking very hard on that one. I will say one very strange thing. I do have a form of arthritis that I've had since I was 17. And during the time when this rock was in my possession, it was fairly well controlled. And then it did start to flare up more after I gave the rock away. But it's a good thing that modern medicine has been able to help me. I don't have to go looking for weird rocks to self-medicate with.
That's probably for the best. Yes.
Yeah, I think so. Definitely
Yes.
For the best.
Well, I see we're right at the end of our allotted time here. So, and I think we've got all the questions addressed and really eloquently. And thank you so much for this conversation, Elise. I really appreciated it. And I know the audience has had a really great time. So I want to just thank everyone for being here, and join me in thanking Elise and congratulating her on the launch of this amazing book. So congrats.
Thank you so much, Warren. Thank you, Vlad. Yes, thank you everyone for being here. I really appreciate it. And thank you to the University of Regina Press for being such a wonderful press to work with. Thank you to Karen Clark and Randy Lundy, there he is, and everybody else who helped out and allowed the book to become a book.
All right, that's a
Okay.
great way to conclude. I think. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Reminder that the book can be purchased. The code is just in the chat there, and thank everyone at the press. I know everyone's gonna really enjoy this book and get a lot out of it, and you'll read it and you'll reread it because the stories and the poems they're just so rich.
Thank you. On that note, I will say good night.
All right, good night. See you, everyone.